Hello and welcome to the New School HR podcast. This is a brand new HR podcast designed for HR professionals who are on a journey up the ladder and just looking for some advice or some hints and tips that maybe help you along the way. If you wish to know a little bit more about the podcast and why I'm doing it, please feel free to listen to episode 00, the application process. If you're ready to continue, welcome to episode 01, the interview process. So welcome to episode 1, what I'm calling the probation period series. So episode 1 is going to look at the interview process. There's many different platforms of which you can use to apply for a new role. However, I'm just going to look at 4 that I think are quite useful or to share some experiences and tips across the 4. So the first one to begin with is LinkedIn. Now LinkedIn, if you don't know, is a business almost like social media platform where loads of companies and loads of working professionals are registered to. So it's almost like a Facebook, but for the professional world. So the first thing to highlight about LinkedIn is the profile. So the profile is quite key that you get it right, and I think you need to make sure that this is something that is easy for you to use and adapt as you apply for different roles and as you also progress through your career. So as a starting point, the first thing you should really do is obviously have your career history on there. So you get the option to actually add as many roles as you like. Potentially you could add every single individual role, but I think from my own personal experience, I've only listed the ones that potentially are relevant to the roles I'm looking for. So that means that you're going to have to probably flex it depending on the different types of roles you want to apply for. So some of us HR professionals maybe have worked within the retail sector or maybe in a management role. Using your work history needs to be spot on for what you're applying for. So how can we do this? So when I look at making my profile, the first part is the description part. Now I think there's various different methods I've seen across this. I think that potentially my one at the moment is probably a bit too long, but this needs to be a brief sort of summary about yourself that somebody can look at in a glance, get a little bit of a picture of you and move on through your work history, if that's what they choose to do, or click onto your CV, which I'll come to in a minute. So the profile, biography, if you like, can be done in one or two ways. It can be either bullet points, which outlines the kind of experiences you've had. So for example, for myself, it might be that I've done customer services or online shopping management or logistics, whatever it might be. So that's where I would add it. The second way you can do this is a brief sort of introduction summary, if you like, which covers the same points, but maybe is worded in a more professional manner. I myself have it in a paragraph, which outlines all my different experience. However, I have seen recently that the bullet point system seems to work for this. That's your two sort of methods. And the good thing about LinkedIn is that you could probably see most of the profiles on there. So if you want to take some ideas, you could always look at fellow people with the job title potentially of the role you're looking for. So the next part is the job description or history, if you like. Now, I guess when I first did this, I actually just listed my CV, which is probably a big mistake looking at it, because if my CV's there, why is anyone going to look at it? And if they already seen it and they're not interested, I've kind of closed the door on myself. So now what I advise people to do is put your current work location in, put the roles that are relevant, or making sure that you cover the time span that you've been in your career, because that's quite important. But then what I now do is actually take the job descriptions or the job adverts and take the summary from there. So most of the job descriptions will have sort of a couple of lines or a paragraph about what the role is. And I use that because actually that is what I'm signed up to do, right? And I just leave it as that. That's how I get around that part. Now the other part to look at is the actual skills section. So as you go to the bottom of the page, you actually get the option to add skills that are relevant to you as an individual. Now I myself have somewhere between 30 to 40 skills listed. I'm not sure if that's the right amount. However, I have seen people with around 100, which I think is outrageous personally. However, the flip side to that is the more of these skills that you have, the more likely you are to appear in searches that are done by businesses, which I'll come to in a minute. My advice would be that you put skills in there that potentially people that follow you potentially could endorse you for, which is quite key. And the reason being is that if you have someone who you are connected with who is seen as a highly skilled person in your field, if they actually like one of the skills, I say like, that's like an Instagram thing, right? But if they actually acknowledge it, which is by clicking agree or whatever it is on there, then that highly skilled person actually comes up as liking your post, and that gets put at the bottom there as well. So that's pretty cool. And the other thing you can do is also ask for recommendations. Now, obviously, I think this is dependent on whether or not people know you're actively looking for a role, but this can also be helpful. Again, if you've got people who are at a certain level vouching for you, if you like, that can always be a positive. So the next thing I like about LinkedIn is the fact that you can save your sort of job searches, if you like any sort of job board. And that's pretty cool. So for example, for myself, when I was looking for a new role, I just had the new job title that I wanted, the location that I wanted, and actually I used to get probably an email a day and probably used to see between 3 to 4 vacancies arise sort of pre-COVID. And I'd be honest, for the most part, probably about 80% accurate to what I was looking for. So that's quite handy and useful to know. The other really cool thing about LinkedIn is that you can actually follow businesses. So for example, I might follow Apple. I can follow Apple, and if they put a job on LinkedIn, I'll be notified when that job comes on, if it fits within my criteria or not, which is also pretty cool. It might be that I want to switch my role up and become a technical engineer for the fun of it. So that's pretty cool to have. And I would suggest that try and look for businesses local to where you live, ones who are maybe bigger and maybe have the kind of roles that you'll be interested in. So this is pretty useful stuff. Now, the other useful thing it has is the quick apply. So if you've got the mobile phone app, you can literally, whilst you're eating your breakfast, having your Weetabix, log into the app and just flick through. And within 10 seconds, if there's roles that are quick apply, you can just click those and your application will be submitted. What I have found is you don't seem to, in my experience, come across agencies quite often, which means that you're actually getting through to the recruiter. And some companies or recruiters actually actively promote themselves as a recruiter. So there's actually been instances where I've actually messaged the recruiter directly and just approached them and said, look, are you interested? What are you looking for? Here's my CV. Because the other really useful tool on LinkedIn is that you can see roughly how many people have applied. So I think it goes up in numbers of maybe up to 100. And then after 100, it will say between 100 and 200, and then over 200. So for example, if you saw the vacancy is about 3 weeks old and they've had 200 applicants, of course you can still click apply, but how far are you going to get unless the other 200 have been completely useless? So there's quite a lot of information there on LinkedIn that can really sort of be honed in if you use it to your advantage. I think the other thing which I touched on earlier as well is that you could always have people in your connections that are actually doing the role that you're looking for. And it might be useful to look at their profiles as well to see what the kind of general tasks are or what the accountabilities and stuff like that is. So you can factor that into your own. So LinkedIn, pretty useful tool, although a lot to go on with there. So the next method, I can't really say I've been using too much myself, but one that I'm aware of and I've had a bit of experience with is HR agencies. The reason I say this one is because I actually know of people who have had quite a lot of luck searching for a new role. So HR agencies are pretty good. You probably find that a few of them are actually headed up by former HR directors or professionals, so they have some sort of understanding. Or if they're not in that sort of skill set, they maybe have started a recruitment agency but have come from a specified industry, and actually they'll know what kind of HR professionals are required. So when they do things like screening and stuff, they'll ask you all the right sort of questions. Now, my experience of this wasn't great, but actually when I look back now and reflect, I was a HR assistant or personnel assistant back then, and for some reason I was looking for an HR advisor role without actually being properly skilled. So it might have been that actually the reason why I wasn't so successful is because I was probably in the wrong place at that moment in time. So the HR agencies generally will screen you. I've heard instances where they give CV advice, which has been helpful for those individuals who have been applying for new roles. And they'll also keep you in the loop. And the other thing is that HR agencies, I've also found, will potentially seek you out as well. For example, I've been approached by two in the past where they've actually known the HR director and the HR operations manager where I work. And they've actually said to me that with my length of service in the business and knowing the HR professionals that I was working with, that actually that meant by default, potentially I was highly skilled. So that's also quite good, knowing that, these HR agencies potentially have roles in quite a large geographical area and actually have an awareness of the sort of people that you potentially may be working with. And this obviously will help them push you forward and be able to give some sort of vouch for you as well. Always worth registering this way. I think the reason I haven't is because I've never actually properly looked for a role myself, but I do know of people that have had pretty good experiences. I guess the only thing to sort of say is that you will have to make sure that your CV's up to scratch, which isn't necessarily a bad thing if they're giving you the support to do that. And you'll also have to fill out application forms, potentially go in for sort of a pre-screening interview as well. I'm not sure if they just do this over the phone or if you have to have a more in-depth one. And the other thing I note is that when I did have these kind of interactions, I had to go through probably 2 screenings with the HR agencies. At some points, I was potentially using an hour of my time, which, in the grand schemes isn't a lot, but to not even get in front of the actual interviewer does seem a bit tiresome. However, if you do get this specialist advice and you do get sort of foot in the door that these people can give you, then obviously it's a definite benefit. And the other thing is, these HR agencies do hold roles that potentially don't go on LinkedIn or aren't even publicized anywhere else. So it's always worth having some sort of HR agency in your toolkit in the background. So I think the next one to mention for me is company websites. I wasn't really a believer of this until actually I saw my wife get a job at one of the dream companies that she wanted to work for. And the reason she got that job is because she actually registered on the company website and signed up for job alerts. So I know these things do work from my previous experience of actually recruiting using that method, but I didn't think it would work in big companies for roles that potentially are quite hard. So looking at my wife's job, which is probably quite a vast amount of people trained in, I wouldn't have suspected that she would have actually got somewhere from that. But actually, she got notified as soon as the role became available through the email, and she then got given a link to apply. I'm not sure if she did any actual sort of pre-activity before getting that, but I do remember that she did that. So I myself followed this, and I actually looked at a couple of websites myself for businesses, and I actually have registered, your standard Facebooks, Googles, Apple, all those kind of dream jobs, the Arsenal role, and, I myself have only received a few emails, but I suspect that the HR teams there are pretty happy and probably not giving up their roles willingly. So that might be a reflection of that. But it's always worth doing that. Seeing companies, like I said in the LinkedIn bit, seeing what companies are around you and just registering, because not all companies will use the LinkedIn method. You'd be surprised how many companies don't actually have internal recruiters. So in order to use a LinkedIn profile, you would need to have an actual dedicated internal person. Well, I would suggest you do. I think it's quite a lot of maintenance to do that. So company websites, if you've got companies with high volume of roles, or like I say, potentially don't have a recruiter, they might use an internal system, which is quite easy to upload roles, upload a job description and use that as a recruitment tool. So yes, it's quite time consuming. Yes, you might have to fill in 30 to an hour's worth of assessments or forms or cover letters, etc. But it's actually worth it if it's a company that you really are interested in, or you can align yourself with in terms of their working values or their benefits. And a lot of companies out there now have this stuff publicized, which is pretty good as well. So you can get a pretty good understanding of the business, a pretty good understanding of what you expect before you even actually had an interview. So don't rule that one out. So the next one I would mention is not really where I would apply, but I think something that's pretty cool to have in your back pocket if it's done the right way, and that is an actual HR network. Now, what do I mean by a HR network? Knowing people within the HR world that actually influence and make decisions when it comes to roles. So, for example, if you happen to be a HR assistant for a pretty good HR manager or a HR director, it's worth building that relationship to a point where potentially you can exchange numbers or even just email addresses and actually follow what they're doing. And likewise, I myself, as a HR business partner, if I've got people that I've really connected well with and really built up a good, solid sort of HR relationship with and fully trust them, I would always attempt to try and get that person's personal details, whether that's an email address or a phone number, because actually you never know when you're going to have a vacancy. So, for example, I myself have found myself now in a new role without a HR advisor. So, would I go to my black book? Well, yes, I would, if it wasn't a role that was actually quite out of the way for the people that I would like to put in the role. So I think having a HR network, just checking in with people, there are some people that go out for dinner and stuff like that. I'm not really that kind of person, if I'm honest. I'll probably just send a silly meme or a picture or something like that. But it's always worth just checking in sort of once a month. Doesn't even have to be that. Some of the people I speak to, I don't speak to for 6 months, but it's just so that people remember who you are, not to necessarily ask for a job. But like I say, if you know where someone's working, you happen to see a vacancy, you might not always be at the first thought of their mind, or they may not even know where your progress is today. So it's always worth keeping in touch with people, just having a friendly discussion, just chit-chatting, what you've been up to, how's things going, how's the role going, that kind of stuff. Always beneficial. So the next part to talk about is ye olde CV, the bit that everybody loves. So just a couple of pointers from myself, and these are the things that I kind of look for when I'm looking at a CV, or the kind of things I implement when I'm doing one myself. So the first thing I would say is try and keep it to a maximum of 3 to 4 pages. Now this may be hard for some people who have done a multiple of roles. I totally understand that. However, this ain't going to look good anyway. Somebody who has done potentially 6 or 7 roles doesn't look too good in a short period of time, unless they're doing contract roles, unless they've got some kind of substantial reason. So most people, for the most part, if you're looking at your career and you're going up the ladder, you've probably done about 3 to 4 roles. So that should be able to fit into sort of 2 pages, if we're being honest, in terms of actual jobs that you've held. So the way I list it is obviously current role at the top, working my way back. Now I actually only list my sort of HR relevant roles, and then I've put where I've done management as that time span, but I've actually used the same sort of part twice just to elaborate on that. So the way I would format it is the job title, the number of people that I'm supporting, and whether that's regional or the location. And that's kind of the first line of that part of the job. The next part I do is I actually, as I said in the LinkedIn bit, take apart from the actual job description for the role. The reason I do that is because I don't want to invent the wheel, or I don't want somebody to actually be looking at potentially my job description and actually telling me that I'm doing something totally different. And I think if you keep it to that way, 9 times out of 10, if you've actually been, keeping up with your HR sort of career side, if you like, you're probably going to hopefully have made sure that that job description is pretty much what you're doing. So that's where I take that bit from. The next bit I do is I do accountabilities. And the reason I do that is to actually highlight main sort of themes. But the way I do this is through bullet points. So I don't sort of put, for example, talent management, 9-box grid, appraisals, etc., etc. I'd actually just put talent management. And the reason I do that is because when I'm actually in an interview, if somebody asks me a question around the actual process, if I've done my research, I maybe know a little bit about what their talent process is already, and I can almost, through either experience or, theory or whatever it might be, answer it to what I believe that they need at that moment in time. So I always keep the bullet points, and I just keep it as a title. The next thing I'll do after that is my achievement. And I think this is quite key. And I think a lot of people actually underestimate what an achievement is. So for example, if you're a HR assistant and you've actually redesigned the whole filing system, that is an achievement. Or it might be that you've generated a report that's actually used by the HR business partners or the HR director. Actually ask where these reports are going. Because I've actually seen in my current role that, the HR assistants there are actually producing reports that are actually used at a group level. And that's quite big stuff. And not something that maybe they know, maybe they do, but these reports are quite important. The other thing is that these HR assistants at times are the first port of call. So sometimes they actually do get involved in some quite serious ER stuff at a very early stage. and sometimes it's their input which can make or break a case. So I think they need to think, as a HR assistant, you need to think about what it is you actually do, and actually think about what have you achieved, what is the stuff you've implemented, what do you do to support, what have you created, and list these things. It's very important. And it goes for the same for the HR advisor role. When I was in that role, I think the HR advisor role gets stuck in the whole ER side of things. It's labeled as an ER role, but there's actually a lot of good things that come out of a HR advisor. And again, it's about actually knowing that. Now, the easiest way to do this for myself is I have a notes app with a tick box. And every time I learn a new skill, or I do a new project, or I complete something, I actually add to it. So this has been rolling for about 5 years since when I become a HR advisor. I'm currently a business partner, and I've actually put it into my new role, and I've actually seen it in my new role. I've actually picked up about 15 different things whilst in probation. So it is quite a handy tool to have. So a couple of other things I like to see, or I suggest to put on the CV, is the following. So the first one is hobbies. Guys, let us know a little bit about you, right? How am I going to know a team fit potentially if I don't know what you're interested in? And you know what? I think you should be upfront with these things. I don't think that you should be worried about how people might perceive it or whatever, because that is you as an individual. And the only way people are going to understand you is if you put things on there. So, yes, I can't lie. As a HR business partner, at 35 years old and a father, I do like to play video games. I can't lie. I do like a bit of Pro Evo. And that's on my CV because that gives a little bit of insight into me. So I think this is quite important. And I think actually what you'll probably find is any good manager in 2020 should be looking about the different characters that they can put into their teams. And this is a pretty good way of seeing it. So I always try and have this on there at some point, and I always advise people to do it. And it does give up some good questions to ask as an actual interviewer. The next thing I suggest is actual further learning. I think a lot of people miss this. So we all know that we have to put our school education. But what about the additional training you've done in your previous roles? So for example, I have some city and guilds management accreditations. That wasn't in school, not something I've listed in education, so I put it in further education. So always try and remember what you've actually done. I've done food safety, I've done a liquor license, I've done all these kind of things. And this actually says to an employer that because I've been enlisted with these kind of skills to be assigned to me, that I have a capacity to continue learning whilst I'm actually in a job, and B, a level of responsibility. These are high risk things such as alcohol and food safety. And you get things like machinery, assigned trainer, all these kind of things. It's definitely worth putting on there, and actually adds a bow to your arrow, if you were. I think that's the correct term. The next thing I ask people to think about is the operating systems that they use, because I think in 2020 we got the Android operating system, we got the Apple iOS operating system, we got the Mac system, we got Windows. So these are actually all different systems, and actually, I foresee that as careers progress or roles progress, it's going to be important to know this. So for example, my company phone is an Android, and I mainly use Apple devices. I'm using an Apple right now to communicate this. My personal phone is an Apple, but my TV and my work phone is an Android. So you need to know how to use these things. It can be quite tricky. There's things I know on an iPhone how to do. I have no idea how to do it on an Android, and people have to kind of show me. So I think this is something that people will look at a bit more. And the next thing is, why do we never put the HR systems on there? I very rarely see a HR CV which actually says, I know how to use Oracle, or I know how to use Kronos, or I know how to use whatever other systems are out there. There's so many. I only know a handful because I've only worked for 3 companies. But, let's put on there the systems that we use, because as a recruiter, there are systems that are very similar. When I came and I saw, and I can't think of it, Chris 21. It's actually a very similar system to Oracle, although the people that use it don't really know that because they've not used Oracle. But anyway, employees out there might look at the system piece and say, oh yeah, that's good, a HR assistant knows how to use this. Or, somebody applying for a HR advisor role knows how to use a system, which is handy. It means they can be self-sufficient. So it's always quite good to have something on there around the actual systems that you can use. So another key thing that I think people should actually think about when they're writing their CV is the dates. This is very, very key. This is very key for those companies that need very specific references or very specific career history timelines. In the current place that I work in, we have a sort of contract with well, I can't really go into it, but we have contracts with companies that required us to have 5 years background, and we can't have a gap of more than 28 days. And actually, when you do something like just put a month, you're leaving yourself open. So it's very important that you have the actual dates of these roles and that they're able to be backed up with. And I think lastly, the other one is references. So I myself have never actually put reference details. I've actually just put referees available upon request. But I have seen many people put their references on there. Now, I think this is okay if your CV is current. However, if it's not, that could be kind of awkward when a company tries to reach out to an employer that you haven't worked with for 7 years. So I think just have to think about that. I think a couple of other things that I like to just mention in terms of the CV. So I am for putting your actual postal address on there because it allows employees to see where you actually live and they can think about the commute and stuff like that. So I think that's quite good. But things I wouldn't put on there is things like nationality. Shouldn't have a relevance, and it's not something that you can be recruited for. And the other thing is age. Some people say that, well, if you see the schooling education I did, that kind of tells you I'm in a certain age bracket, which I understand. But, I've seen CVs with people's age. And the other thing that I've seen is pictures. I've actually seen passport pictures almost stapled to a CV. I think that's kind of creepy personally. I don't know if anyone's had any joy with that. I think nowadays with things like LinkedIn, your picture's going to be on there anyway. Quite happy to have feedback about if this works or not, but I find it personally a little bit creepy. Not quite sure what the intensive purpose of that is. So the next part to talk about is the actual interview itself. It's a big day. It can be stressful. It can be overwhelming. But actually, sometimes I think, if I had the opportunity to talk to people that come into an interview that I'm sitting in, I just want people to relax, which I know is quite easy to say, but actually, we're all the same, right? We've all been there. We've all applied for a role. And I think, if you're the person doing the interview, don't be a prick. Don't come in there and be stern-faced and all this and that. Just remember that somebody is actually out there trying to get somewhere in the world. And you know what? If you're the actual candidate, again, it's very easy for me to say, but try and relax. Try and be yourself. Try and have a little bit of a laugh. If you're that kind of person. If you're not, try and get your character across. Because actually, what we want to do is recruit someone for the job and the team fit. And if we don't see the real you, we're not going to know if you fit or not. And I guess the other piece is as well that we've got your CV, but we want to know a little bit about you. We want to know a little bit of how you did this, especially if you followed my bullet point advice, which doesn't really say a lot. And this is why, because actually, if everything is on your CV, potentially I'm not going to interview you because I already know everything about you. So this is a really great opportunity now for you to tell me a bit about yourself, a bit about where you've been, and a little bit about what you experienced. So I guess the other thing to remember is, what is the role you're applying for? And try and keep at that level, which is, I guess, hard if you're trying to impress someone. But actually, if you're applying for a HR advisor role, but you're trying to tell me that you're basically a HR business partner, I'm not going to lie. I'm going to think to myself, why didn't you just apply for a HR business partner role? So, try and keep it to a level where that is what you're applying for, and that's what you're able to articulate. Because most of the time, if you're not applying for a temp role, the role that you're applying for is seen as a role that wants to be around for at least 12 to 24 months. So you need to sort of almost sell yourself that you're here for that journey, even if you're not. But at that point, even if it's a foot in the door, make sure it's at that level. And you can always say, later on that, my intention is to progress. But try and keep it at the level of the actual role you're applying for. I think the other thing, remember why you're applying. And this might be for various different reasons. So I think for myself, the reason I applied for this role that I'm in today was actually the work-life balance. And I stood by that story because that was the reality. I really liked the company I was working for. I liked the people, the team, but I just didn't like the traveling. So that was quite easy for me. But I think you will get other people who maybe are not happy with the manager or something like this. And that might be the reason why they're actually looking to leave. And I think try and articulate that a bit better. So it might be that actually, you're looking for something different You're looking for a different path almost, because there are different styles of HR even within the one role. So for example, the last role I was very much about transformation, and actually that's all I did for 5 years, for the most part, transformation and talent building. The role that I'm in today is actually not that. Here it's about building a team, it's about building a HR presence. So it's a totally different set. And actually, if I was looking at the job description, I saw that as well. So remember why you are applying for a new role, and try and make sure that you convert that in a professional way. A HR person's not going to want to sit with a HR professional and be told that, the manager's an idiot that they work for, and actually that's why they're not wanting to be there, or, they don't like the benefits or something like that, which may be the case, but I think you have to articulate a bit more than that. You have to expand on it and actually make people believe that you're there for a reason, which hopefully you are, because if you're not, you soon get found out, and it would have just been a waste of everyone's time. I think the next part that I would always say to people is that when you're in an interview rather, remember that you're not the finished article, right? Even if you're a business partner or a very experienced HR advisor, you're not the finished article, and it's okay. And I think I personally always draw reference to, if I'm being asked questions and I have a clear gap, I tell them I don't know what the hell you're talking about. Not in that sense, but I'll say to them quite clearly, you know what, I don't have any experience of that, or that's not something I'm familiar with, or that's something I have an awareness of, but I've not actually done it myself. So for example, 2P. I've never actually done 2P. I do know the sort of outlines of what that process is and how you do it, but I don't have the experience of doing it. It's not on my CV. And if somebody asks me, that's why it's not there, because I ain't done it. Okay? So it's okay. And remember that you're there to learn. If you have a gap, what's the gaps that you bridge that the rest of the team don't have? Because that's what they'll be thinking. You may not know what the rest of the team is, but I guarantee you, if you're sitting in front of someone, you're there to fill a gap. And that means you play on what your strengths are, and you make sure that you can give account of the specific questions they ask you. So for example, the role that I'm in today was very much around, the sort of ER management and building a team and upskilling a management team that hadn't had much development or was fairly young in its managerial experience. So that's what I played on, because that's what I've done, and I've done it in a very similar environment, which they managed to see on the CV. So just remember, if you have a gap, that is totally fine. Nobody is expecting you to be the finished article. So the next part I want to talk about is one that I think is actually something that you do need to consider, and that is the dress code. So you might be thinking, well, how do I know? I just wear a suit. Well, I've actually been in scenarios where I've been in interviews in a suit, and I've been well overdressed. Overdressed from a point of view of the person that's interviewing me and the other candidates. So I actually had an interview. This was a few years ago, actually, to be fair. Maybe we're talking 7-8 years ago. And it was for a fashion retailer. Really nice office. Really cool place to hang out. They had a hanging swing and everything. It was amazing. And everyone else was wearing jeans and trainers. I saw Air Force Ones. It was crazy. It was off the hook, and I was there in a suit. And I already immediately knew that that wasn't the right outfit for that environment. So if you can, have a look at what the environment is through the website. I then had another interview process, maybe the same month, with another fashion retailer. And in that one, I actually wore one of those snood tops. I don't know if you remember, that was the thing back in sort of 2008, those snood kind of things. Anyway, I wore that, and the interviewer who was interviewing me from Barcelona via Skype, yes, guys, we had Skype facilities back in 2009, were quite impressed with what I was wearing, which I thought was phenomenal because I just winged it. So that is quite important. The next thing is to be on time. Quite a few people underestimate that. And if you're not going to be on time, give someone a call. Or if you need to have it rescheduled, we are working professionals. We might have a meeting that's changed or something like that. Reach out to someone when you find out, because that's the only way that we can change it, right? So reach out, or if you're going to be late, send a message, send an email, something, so at least you can demonstrate that you did it. But try not to do it 2 minutes before you're going to be late. you're probably going to know about half an hour beforehand because you usually have to be there 15 minutes early, right? So don't be a prick. Tell someone you're going to be late. So the next part is do your company research, people. You're applying for a role. This might be a salary jump of 2 times or something like that for yourself. Spend a bit of time learning a little bit about the company. People like that in general. The other thing is you could potentially catch the person out who's interviewing you. I say catching out because that's happened to me before, where I've been in an interview and I've done my company research, and I actually turned around and said, as part of my questions bit at the end, I tried to have a look at the company, and actually the last thing was from 2 years ago. So what's that about? And they actually said, oh, we don't know. You've done more than us. Having a look at the company website, usually there's an About Us page, or the good old Wikipedia is a good thing. And the thing I've seen more commonly is actually people just doing a Google search of the actual company name and looking at what the last sort of press or news was. And the recruiter who works where I work now, she was actually quite concerned about what might come up if somebody did a Google search. Would they still be interested in applying for us? So these things are taken quite seriously. So I think make sure you do your research. It's always a good positive thing for the recruiter to see that you are interested in the business. The next thing I would say is try to answer the questions to the best of your ability. And the reason I say this is because, coming back to my earlier point, if you don't know something, just say it. But I think at the same time, where you've put the CV in the bullet point sections, if you've done a CIPD as an example, or you've seen a HR advisor who works above you, or you've seen a HR business partner do something in practice and actually you've understood it, why not articulate that? Why not explain that? You know what? I myself have not done this, but this is a situation I'm aware of, or this is a theory that I know. This can be just as good, because if me as a recruiting manager can see that this is a theory that you would apply, yes, you may not have done it, but if I've got a good sense of your character because it's come out through the interview, then your theory sounds pretty good, then the likelihood is I'm going to be happy with what I hear. So that honesty and transparency piece is quite important at that stage, and I think that can sort of make or break an interview. I've seen it at times where people have been interviewed and they have the least experience, but because the theory was good enough and they was able to articulate it, and actually the character showed that they had a bit of resilience about them, or a bit about them to actually, navigate their way through a business, that was enough for that person to secure the job, and actually they've gone on to do quite well. Sometimes the experienced person only has the experience that they have and actually can't do things because they're not dynamic enough. So don't underestimate the value of having an understanding and having a little bit about you. So the next part of the interview, when we get to the end, we're finally feeling a little bit relieved. We've answered all the questions, and then they turn around and say to you, do you have any questions for us? And I think 9 times out of 10, I ain't got a question for you. But this is what, people ask. And I guess I'll just give you a couple of rundowns of some of the ones that I would probably ask or think are pretty good to ask, or ones that I've been asked. But I'll start with the ones you shouldn't ask. I personally don't think you should be asking about a salary. I think that if they ask you about the salary, that means that they're interested in you. And I always kind of personally wait to hear if they ask me what my salary expectation is. I might be wrong, but at the end of the day, when you apply for the role, when you've had your telephone interviews or screening stage, you've probably been asked this in that part, what your salary is, and they'll probably tell you we can or can't do that. So be a little bit sensible with that. By the way, I just realized I never covered telephone interviews, but I did cover screening, I guess. I could give you a quick rundown on that right now. This is off the fly. So telephone screening interviews generally are to find a little bit about you, just to sort of get a grasp of what you've been doing, a sort of steer. I don't really like this, and the reason I say that is because 9 times out of 10 you're speaking to a recruitment person, and actually, unless they've done the HR role themselves or have a pretty good understanding, that's not going to be very good. However, I found that 9 times out of 10 I get through the telephone stage. So I think if you have a little bit about you, which is a common phrase that I use, if you know a bit about the role, you're able to articulate it, and like I say, you've done your research and stuff beforehand, you should be able to pass those stages. I think it gets a bit tiresome when you have to do 2 before the actual interview, but some places are like that. 9 times out of 10, it's a sort of extension, so they might ask you to elaborate something. So if you've used something, make a note of what you used in the first one, and then be prepared to explain it in the second one, or even in the actual face-to-face interview. So coming back to the sort of questions. So as I say, wouldn't ask about salary. Things that I would ask is, what are the actual opportunities in the role? I don't really know what the structure is unless you've told me. If you haven't told me, what's the next route for me, and how are you going to help me get there? Because, I want to know if you want me tied in for 2 years, what I'm going to get after that 24 months, which is fair, right? The next thing I would ask, which might be a bit contentious, is why did the past person leave? So, for me, most of the people that have left me, bar one, have left because they've either got more money for doing the same role or they've got promoted, which for me is perfectly fine. But, if we hear that the last person didn't do left, and, the feedback is that there's a lot of gaps in the actual role that's been left behind, if you put 2 and 2 together, that's not looking too good. That's not to mean that the company or the role is not potentially the right role for you, but I think it means you should elaborate further with such things as, well, what's the opportunities for the area I'll be supporting? What's missing in their eyes, and, what support will I get in terms of putting that in place? Although depending on the level you're applying for, you're the one to put that in place. But this is just a question I would ask. The next thing I would ask is, why did no one internally get the role? If it's a sort of role that has, a promotion element to it for the low behind, why have we not got anyone from there? Why am I sitting there? And sometimes companies will advertise roles to actually benchmark against what they have internally. So that's where that question came from for myself. But the other thing to note is that, is it because there's a huge gap between, say, for example, the HR advisor or the business partner role in terms of what that business operates as? Or is it because, it's a fairly new team and actually there's support there? Which I think is also quite important to know if you're someone that's going into a new business and also with a new team who's inexperienced. That's the kind of thing you want to know about. So that's why I always keep that in. The next one I would ask is, what is the actual specific HR project going on? Now, they're not going to tell you fully, but it would be cool to have some sort of overview of what is actually going on. And I think that's one thing I wish I kind of asked before I joined this role. Not to say that I'm not enjoying it, but, it might have given me a bit of a steer. So I did ask that in the previous role to sort of say, what is the HR team working on at the moment? And it was things like policies, letters. Good to have an understanding, because it might be that you're expected to come into one of these projects and hit the ground running because your predecessor hasn't finished the project or was actually going to be tasked with doing something that's now going to be handed over to you. So I like to know that if I've got 2 options, which I did in this instance, I'd like to know what I'm going to be committing to either during or after the probation, because that's quite important. If you've got a specific project as part of probation, you'll want to know that you're able to make a stamp on it or influence it or even pass it, right? So that is why I asked that question. So that's pretty much it for the topics I was going to cover. However, as I've been recording this, I've started thinking about different instances that happened in the past in terms of feedback, receiving, not receiving, incorrect feedback given, or just real plain fucking rude feedback I received. So I am going to share a bit about this. This isn't scripted. This wasn't something I was going to talk about, so I'm not looking at any notes at the moment. You might think to yourself, wow, this guy was looking at notes in the first part. I actually was. I was trying to structure it, but as this is episode 2 for me of a podcasting recording, I'm sure I'll get better over time. However, let's free flow. So no notes. The iPad is off. So the feedback piece. So I think this is quite important as a hiring manager, mainly to ensure that the feedback given to a fellow HR professional or somebody that is looking to progress or whatever it is constructive. So why did they not get the role? And I think you have to be honest. So there's been interviews that I had done for, say, for example, HR advisor. There's one that sticks out where the individual that applied was very, very heavily reliant on policies. And actually, everything they said was okay up until the point we realized that they needed the policy book. We as a business was just not in a place for. So the feedback I gave was, look, interview was really well. However, what came across in the interview process was that you're very big on policies, very keen to explore them, very keen to understand them. And actually you implement and lead from a position of policies. However, we're in the process of developing those, and actually these haven't been instilled. So whilst, yes, you're very good at policies, very good at following them, you haven't had experience of actually building policies. And when we asked you questions around it, unfortunately, you wasn't, able to tell us where you would source information from, how you keep up to date, how you would implement changes into policies, and therefore that is the reason why you was unsuccessful. Now, that's something that person can take away and build on and absorb and maybe look at how they operate a bit different. The other thing I said to them was that, this role actually gives you a lot of freedom in terms of the decision making and the processes that you want to follow with your managers. And so then that means that if he's still in a current role or if he gets a different role, maybe that's something he can look at as a skill set as well. So for me, that was a bit constructive. It wasn't any more than 5 minutes. It didn't take up a lot of my time, and hopefully that person left with some sort of understanding as to why he didn't get the role with me. Now, some of the feedback I received, which I'm going to share, which is quite personal. So I had one incident where I'd applied for a role. It was a HR. I can't even remember what the role was called actually, but my understanding was it was an almost HR assistant role, but I can't lie. I was working in retail for a lot less money, so I thought, you know what, let's just give it a go. So I get there, had the interview, and the agency phoned me up and said, look, we got some feedback. She said, oh, that's cool. So I said, what is it? And they said that these, the two women who interviewed me said that I wasn't actually friendly, that I didn't want to shake their hands. They also said that when they explained about getting very liquid, that I turned my nose up at it, which wasn't the case at all. I remember that interview quite clearly. I was actually soon to be a father. That's why it stands out, because it's one of the roles that I interviewed for before my son was born. And I remember I went to shake the woman on the left's hand, and she literally just pulled her hand away from me. So I was like, okay. I sat down, I was talking to them. I was how I'm talking to you guys. You could probably see that I'm quite talkable. I wasn't standoffish at all. And when they were telling me about the sort of ad hoc collecting of groceries and stuff like that, I just said, oh, okay, that's cool. That wasn't in the job description, but, I'm okay with that. I don't have a problem. I have a car. I can get about, or, how does it work out? I was actually asking questions about it, so I was quite surprised when I was told that I turned my head up on it. That wasn't the case at all. I might have been caught off guard, but, I was asking questions. So to me, that was a lie. Now, there was another company that I had an interview for. It's a really big company in central London, a global company. And I was actually headhunted for through LinkedIn. And I remember it was like a 40K role. And I thought to myself, this is not something I could probably do given the level I was at the time. But this person, the recruitment advisor, was very adamant that I could. So I thought, you know what, why not? It's an experience. And I got there, and it was this guy, this HR director, and he was swearing at me. And I remember one of the things he said was, what do you think of our values? So I started to proceed. He said, yo, I don't give a fuck what you think about the values. And I was like, well, okay, fair enough. Obviously I was taken aback by that. I had a rucksack on a day, a rucksack which had my iPad in. This was back in 2012, so iPads were not, fully taken off, but I'd actually done a presentation, and it was an L&D role I'd applied for, and I'd done a bit of L&D at the time, so I had some workshops I wanted to show him. So that's why I had the rucksack, but I never got to actually take the iPad out the bag. It all ended pretty quickly, which is fair enough. At the end of the day, they obviously were looking for something more than what I was. But I remember when the agency guy gave me the feedback, and I said to him, well, what was it? And he said, well, the guy didn't like your shoes. I was like, right, I don't really know why that's a problem. They were smart shoes, black, polished, went with the suit I was wearing. And he said, well, he just doesn't like that style of shoe. I was like, okay, fair enough. There's not much I can do there. You don't get an award for that. That's not something you could look at in terms of actual shoe style. And the next thing he said was that I had a rucksack. So I said, okay, what's the problem with a rucksack? He goes, well, people don't carry rucksacks. So I said, well, why didn't you just ask me that? And he said, okay, so why was you? So I said, well, I was actually working in the day, and then I had to leave work, go back to work, and I also had a gym session. And I also actually had an iPad in my bag, which was I was going to use to present some stuff. And he was like, well, why would you carry a rucksack? I was like, well, who carries a 400-pound device on the underground in their hand? And he was like, oh. But the worst thing was the guy was laughing. So I was like, this isn't really constructive. So, there are assholes out there. There are people that are going to, almost lie or deceive you, or even, looking back at that experience now, I just think, was that just for a laugh? Looking back, I was a lot younger, a lot more naive. So I think have your wits about you. Make sure you feel okay about the whole process and the job you're applying for. Do as much research as you can. And when you get there, enjoy it. Try and let your character come out. And hopefully it all works out for you. So that has been episode 1 of the New School HR podcast. We've broke ground. If you listened to the other podcast, that was more of an introduction to myself. And if you listened all the way through, thanks for doing so, because I definitely probably wouldn't listen to my career anyway. So this is a brand new podcast, as I said right at the beginning. This has all been produced by myself. This has all been scripted by myself through the tools that I have in front of me. I hope this obviously progresses. And, I appreciate for this first episode, or the previous one as well, it's not going to be the best production value. I started this literally 8 days ago, including the logo, designing, learning how to record, digging out a MacBook, which I hadn't used for years, learning how to use the recording system. I've purchased a mic. So, these are the early days. Hopefully the production gets better. Hopefully I can invest a bit more into this, but hopefully you've got something out of this show. Hopefully you got something you can take away, and always welcome any feedback. I'm not going to lie, if you put too many negatives or stuff like that, I probably ain't going to read it, but if this thing's constructive, I'll definitely make sure I read as many of the comments as I can. And if there's suggestion, hints and tips for myself, definitely will put it on there. Please remember that these views are my own, okay? So these are things that work for me. I want to be very clear on that, if they work for you, that's amazing. Hopefully you look at other platforms as well. I don't want you to think that this is a sole platform that people should be listening to. This is an aid. Hopefully you've got something out of it. I'd like to hear if you did. I'd like to hear some of the positive stuff too. Hope you've enjoyed it. And there will be another 4 more episodes coming out as part of series 1, which I'm labeling the probation period. So until the next one, thanks for having me. Have a good day, evening or morning, and enjoy yourselves.